Greetings everyone. So today we're going to be talking about violence resistance in the 1920s. So following World War I, there's a series of 25 race riots that broke out in 1919, really over the span of 10 months, most of which took place in the summertime. And we term this time Red Summer. Red meaning violent bloodshed, right? That's what the red stands for. Not passion. Right, and so you have a large-scale African-American migration to the north, industrial labor competition, overcrowding in urban ghettos, and also a greater militancy among Black war veterans who had fought to preserve democracy, right, abroad. And all of these things really are kind of fermenting or boiling into this pot that leads to white antagonistic aggression and destruction. And so these riots took place in New York, in Memphis, Tennessee, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, Baltimore, New Orleans, Wilmington, Delaware, Omaha, Nebraska, New London, Connecticut, Bisbee, Arizona, Longview, Texas, Knoxville, Tennessee, Norfolk, Virginia, Putnam County, Georgia, and other places and other places and other places. And truly the goal of these riots was a racial cleansing. This was not oftentimes a targeted attack. It was literally, there's a Black person, let's murder this Black person. We're going to talk about 3 of these riots, the first of which is the Chicago Race Riot of 1919. Then we will also talk about the Elaine Massacre that took place in the same year, and then we'll talk about Rosewood. So, the recipe for a riot in Chicago. There was pressure for adequate housing. You have an influx of African Americans moving to Chicago, right? So you had the Black population increasing from 44,000 people in 1910, I was about to say in 2010, in 1910, to more than 109,000 in 1920, right? So we see a mass increase in just the span of a decade of the African American population. But more specifically, the riot was triggered by the death of a young Black man on July 27th. He had been swimming in Lake Michigan, and he drifted into an area that was not explicitly, but quietly understood to be reserved for whites. And he was stoned to death and shortly drowned while he was swimming. So when the police refused to arrest this white man who Black observers held responsible, crowds grew, people became indignant, and while gathering on the beach, and then as a result, the riot began, right? And also we see a lot of rumors sweeping the city as sporadic fighting begins to break out between gangs and mobs of both races. And this violence escalated each time, like with each incident, the violence grew and grew and grew. And for 13 days, this riot took place in Chicago. Despite the fact that state militia had been called out on the 4th day. Right, so really what we're seeing here is militia-sanctioned riot mob violence taking place. And by the end of the 13th day, you had 38 people who were dead, 23 Blacks, 15 whites, 537 people were injured, and 1,000 Black families were made homeless as a result of this riot. In Elaine, Arkansas, September 30th, 1919. You have poor Black sharecroppers who are frustrated with receiving unfair and extremely low wages, and they decided that they were going to organize. And so they met at a church nearby in the area of Elaine, and they enlisted the help of a white lawyer from the big city of Little Rock, Arkansas, named Ulysses Bratton, and they asked him to come to Elaine to potentially press for fairer profits from the share of their labor, right? white people in the town of Elaine found out that these African Americans were organizing. And that night, a group of local men, some of whom were affiliated with local law enforcement, fired shots into the church. These sharecroppers, some of them had arms, as it was very common to live in the South and to be armed, whether it's because you're hunting for deer or self-defense. And so the shots were returned. One white man was killed. And word spread rapidly about the death of this one white man, right? And so rumors arose that the sharecroppers who had formerly joined a union known as the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, or the PFHUA, were leading an organized insurrection against white residents of Phillips County. Governor Charles Brough called for 500 soldiers from nearby Camp Pike to round up the heavily armed Negroes. The troops were under order to shoot to kill any Negro who refused to surrender immediately. However, of course, these soldiers went well beyond that, as well as the local vigilantes of the town, and they killed at least 200 African Americans, although, and that's the official count, estimates run actually much higher than that. And mind you, the killing was indiscriminate. Men, women, children, anybody who was nearby was slaughtered. And amidst all this violence that was perpetrated by white people, we also see 5 white people dying. And also black people being held accountable for those deaths, whether they committed them or not, right? And so we see dozens of African Americans becoming defendants in a really hastily convened and shoddily convened trial, torturing and coercing people into, incriminating testimony. And 12 of these men were sentenced to death. Mind you, this case took like moments to deliberate. The trial changed venue, so on and so forth. If anybody's like, hey, this sounds like the Central Park 5. Yeah, I will argue on steroids, right? And so you have the NAACP deciding to take on the case. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the court actually sided with the defendants. And the Supreme Court basically cited that, hey, y'all had an all-white jury, which made this trial a little unfair. A lack of opportunity to testify on the behalf of the defendants. Can you imagine? There's a trial for your life. You have been sentenced to death. You can't even testify. That confessions were created under torture. There was a denial of a change of venue, and also pressure from the mob, right, to indict and to convict. Because even during this initial trial, if they had been found innocent, the mob waiting outside the door would have definitely not accepted that and then found them guilty and lynched all of them anyway, right? But this trial was huge, right? Because it really set the precedent for future cases who were seeking appeals on the behalf of unjust trial procedures as a result of all-white juries and so on. And many people, black and white, were very surprised by the outcome of this trial because traditionally the Supreme Court has primarily focused on the maintenance of the rights of white people. And so this is one of the first times that we see the Supreme Court really acknowledging the rights of black people and also acknowledging the predicament that they were in that many people were defending themselves in relation to a riot, right? As opposed to inciting violence. So January 1st, 1923, the predominantly black town of Rosewood in Central Florida was destroyed. This was largely instigated by the rumor that a white man by the name of Fannie Taylor had been sexually assaulted by a black man in her home in a nearby community. And so a group of white men, believing that this rapist had been a recently escaped convict by the name of Jesse Hunter, they believed him to be hiding in Rosewood, and so they assembled a cavalry of sorts to capture this man. They also somehow came up with the notion that Aaron Carrier and Sam Carter were believed to be accomplices. Carrier was captured and incarcerated. However, Carter was lynched. And so the white mob believed that Aaron Carrier's cousin, Sylvester, was harboring Jesse Hunter. So January 4th, 1923, 20 to 30 white men approached the Carrier home. They shot the dog. And they also, when Sylvester's mother came to the front door to see what this ruckus was about, they murdered her. And so Sylvester was armed, defended his home, killed 2 of the men, wounded 4 others before he was killed himself. Word got out that 2 white men had been murdered. Of course, no context was given in this conversation. And so then we see a growing mob that attacked the town, slaughtered animals, burned buildings, and the official report claims that 6 blacks and 2 whites were killed. However, there are some people who argue that there were more people who were murdered. In the end, only 2 buildings remained, a house and the town general store. Upon the murder of Sylvester and Sarah Carrier, many African Americans in the town fled to the swamps. And those who fled were evacuated on January 6th by 2 local train conductors, John and William Bryce. Not all heroes wear capes, right? Some of them are train conductors. And many others were hidden by John Wright, who was the owner of the general store. Other black residents of Rosewood fled to Gainesville and other cities that were further north. And as a result, Rosewood became deserted. No one was charged with any of the Rosewood murders. In 1994, the Florida legislature passed the Rosewood Bill, which entitled 9 survivors to $150,000 each. So, do y'all believe this is fair and just compensation for the atrocity that occurred? Also, it's interesting to note that this is one of the only instances of reparations that has ever taken place in relation to violence meted out against black people that was state sanctioned in one way or another. Europe. So, in addition to just wanton fucking mob violence and lynching, we also have scientific racism to contend with. Yay. And so you have many white Americans who believe that the United States was under siege. They were under attack as European immigrants and black migrants flooded American cities. You have pseudo-scholars warning about the peril that these inferior peoples caused. People like Lothar Stoddard wrote The Rising Tide of Color in 1920, and he argued that people of color would never be equal to white Americans. This is Lothar over here. And so Stoddard stated his case. Here's a quote from Stoddard in 1927. He states, "Even a general knowledge of historical and scientific facts suffices to show the need for a racial basis to our national life, as it has been and as we intended that it shall be. We know that our America is a white America. We know that our America is a white America. America, in the traditional sense of the word, was founded by white men who evolved institutions, ideals, and cultural manifestations which were spontaneous expressions of their racial temperament and tendencies. And the overwhelming weight of both historical and scientific evidence shows that only so long as the American people remains white will its institutions, ideals, and culture continue to fit the temperament of its inhabitants and hence continue to endure. So basically he's saying, one, white is right. White founded this nation, and as long as we continue to have white people in power, this nation will survive. But the moment we let these browns and these blacks and these dirty European immigrants, because that's how they understood them to be, come in here and take over, then we are doomed. And so you have white sociologists teaching at elite academic institutions like the University of Chicago, Columbia University, also reinforcing these ideas in their classrooms and also in the books that they're writing. So they maintained that biological differences separated the races, right? So people of color, including Asians, but especially the blacks, were innately inferior to Caucasians. Black sociologist and scholar Du Bois rejected this as being bullshit, right? And he said that, look, there's no genetic differences between the races. However, there are cultural differences, right? Like you did do this thing called slavery. And so therefore, as a result, folks are underemployed and undereducated, but also do not have generational wealth to fall back on, right? So therefore, oppression, really, and not biology, has created this perception of black inferiority. And then on the left-hand side, there is a debate advertisement, Du Bois against Stoddard. Has the Negro the same intellectual possibilities as other races? Yes, on the Du Bois side. No, on the Stoddard side. Doesn't Stoddard just look like he's going to tie your child to a train track? Anyway, so speaking of just flamboyant, egregious racism, Birth of a Nation. So in 1915, Birth of a Nation was the very first feature film in American history. For those of you who study film, you know that people will consider this to be like the top 100 films of America in all time of all history, right? And so it's like 3 hours long. There is no sound. It is not a talkie, right? And so it's based upon Thomas Dixon's 1905 novel called The Klansman. And in this epic adventure, you have immoral and ignorant quote-unquote Negroes being joined by shady mulattoes and greedy white Republicans who ruthlessly seize control of state government until the heroic and honorable Ku Klux Klan saves the state and rescues its white womanhood. Yeah, I know. And so President Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House, and he was like, oh, this is my shit right here. And he literally is quoted as having said, it's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it's all so terribly true. Oh. The film grossed $18 million, which in today's, 2016's currency, $310 million. $310 million. And it helped to assure a future for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, who produced the film. And it is out of this film, or as a result of this film, that we see the rebirth of the Klan. So you have the Klan largely falling into obscurity post-Reconstruction. However, Birth of a Nation inspired everybody. They said, oh shit, no, we got a mission and a purpose. And so Thanksgiving of 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the Klan was resurrected. By 1925, they had more than 5 million members. So in a 10-year span, they got 5 million people. They had a women's order, a junior order, and a Tri-K club for girls. KKK for kids, y'all. This is actually the picture that you're looking at. This is the kiddie order. This is the children, the Klan children. They understood themselves to be 100% Americans. And what that meant was they were anti-black, they were anti-immigrant, they were anti-Jewish, and they were also anti-Roman Catholic. So the NAACP was outraged by Birth of a Nation's depiction of black people, as it should be. It depicted them as a bunch of lazy rapists who were dysfunctional and couldn't get anything together, right? And so this film also inspired racialized violence, and it also inspired segregation, right? There were increased instances of targeted attacks against African American peoples, that some of which resulted in murders and lynchings. And so the NAACP was able to get the film banned in places like Pasadena, California, Wilmington, Delaware, as well as Boston. And this advocacy and this campaign against the film greatly increased the NAACP's membership. So let's talk a little bit about the NAACP. So the NAACP was formed as a result of a riot, right? So in 1908, there was a race riot that rocked the city of Springfield, and eruptions of anti-black violence, particularly lynching, were horrifically commonplace. However, this riot was the final tipping point that led to the creation of the NAACP. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was established in 1909 as a biracial organization that sought to fight for the rights of African Americans. And so you have a group of white liberals issuing a call for a meeting to discuss racial justice upon the Springfield riot taking place. And there were 60 people in attendance in this meeting. 7 of the 60 were black, but included people like Du Bois, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Church Terrell. So even though this organization, the NAACP, had a foundational commitment to multiracial membership, Du Bois was the only African American on the executive board in terms of the original membership, right? On the original board, he's the only black person in an organization that's supposed to be dealing with the rights of black people. But anyway, so you have Du Bois being made director of publications and research, and in 1910 he established The Crisis, which was the renowned publication of the NAACP. And in addition to nonviolent protest and demonstration, we also see the primary means for advocacy being through the American legal system. The NAACP was able to expand its membership largely based upon their campaign against Birth of a Nation. But in 1916, you have James Weldon Johnson joining the NAACP as field secretary. James Weldon Johnson is pictured bottom right. He was the one who wrote the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is often considered to be the African American or the Black national anthem. And he played a pivotal role in the organization's development and in its growth, right? So you have, in 1916, the NAACP had about 9,000 members, but then in 1920, they had 90,000. And he was able to kind of methodically report some of the gruesome details of lynchings, and so you have some of these directors of the NAACP complaining about Johnson's gruesome detail when describing lynching. But what he stated was, what we need to do is to root out the thing which makes possible these horrible details. I am of the opinion that this can be done only through the fullest publicity, right? So you have Johnson saying, look, y'all sensibilities, like, y'all are triggered, but really what we need to be doing is focusing on the telling, because if through the telling we can bring more awareness, right, around the violence that is lynching, right? And so basically for his own time and medium, Johnson is the one who's recording Black Death on his cell phone and posting it to Facebook, right? To say, hey, look, this is what you need to see. This is what you need to understand is happening, right? Because if you kind of just hear about it with less detail, it doesn't matter as much. But James Weldon Johnson was like, no, this shit needs to be in your face, Okay. So you have in 1918, Johnson hired Walter White to assist him. Walter White is top right. Believe it or not, Walter White is not white. So Walter White is from Atlanta, and like Johnson, he also graduated from Atlanta University. And so Walter White was instrumental not only in his research on lynching, but also in his successful block of segregationist Judge John Parker's nomination by President Herbert Hoover to the U.S. Supreme Court. And a part of why Walter White was so instrumental in his research on lynching was because he's so light-skinned, right? So he was able to go into many southern towns and report on what was happening, and everyone thought he was a white man. And so then as a result, because they think he's a white man, they're giving him white man tea, right? So they're sharing like, oh yeah, Jimbo over there, he's the one that got the Negro and da-da-da-da-da. Like, they're giving the tea to Walter White because they're assuming he's a white man. And as a result, he's able to like learn about lynchings that were commonly not even reported. By the 1920s, you have the Pullman Company, which owned and operated passenger railroad coaches, and it was the single largest employer of black folks in the United States. More than 12,000 black men were porters on Pullman railroad cars. And so you have the founder of the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867, George Pullman, top right, deciding to employ only black men as porters. And for those of y'all who are like, oh my God, he's an advocate for racial justice, not quite. So basically you have Pullman assuming that wealthy white people were accustomed to being waited on by black people. So we should just continue that, keep that going. Also, he realized that, hey, black employees could be and were paid less than white workers. And so you have black men and women who worked on Pullman passenger coaches on the nation's railroads, organizing a labor union in 1925 with A. Philip Randolph at the helm. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So in relation to the labor of a Pullman porter, right? So Pullman porters worked an upwards of 400 hours each month just to maintain these coaches and serve the passengers, right? So these porters had to prepare the cars for the train's departure. They had to service them after the train arrived at its destination. But they were only paid for the duration of the trip. So they weren't paid for the hours of labor of like cleaning the car afterwards or before, right? They assisted passengers. They would shine their shoes. However, they also had to purchase the polish for themselves. And they also had to arrange sleeping compartments. They basically were considered servants by most passengers. And so therefore they had little time to rest while they were on the road. And to add to it, you have many white travelers who would invariably refer to these black men as George. It didn't matter what their actual name was, they just called them George. Porters were paid an average of $67.50 per month, which led to about $810 per year, but with tips might average to about $600 annually, therefore could earn about $1,400 in a year, which is about $19,000 or so dollars in 2016, which was a decent wage at the time. And I know you guys are like, $19,000 was a decent wage. It was if you were black. And so they had to buy their own uniforms during their first 10 years of employment as well. And Pullman employment was the most satisfactory work that any black man could hope to achieve. Many black people were barred from business and industry, right? So we see black men with college degrees often working as sleeping car porters, even though they were poorly paid, right? Compared to many white workers, they still earned more than most black school teachers. Most of these Pullman employees regard themselves as solid, respectable members of the black middle class, and they were, right? And so you have A. Philip Randolph at the helm of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So you have Randolph being born in 1889 in Crescent City, Florida. Randolph was a socialist, and he was an excellent orator, right? An excellent public speaker who had earned a reputation as a radical on the streets of Harlem. And so he attended high school at Cookman Institute, which was later called Bethune-Cookman College. And he migrated in 1911 to New York City, where he attended City College and joined the Socialist Party. He co-founded a publication called The Messenger, which was a monthly socialist journal that grew the attention of federal agents because they regarded it as the only radical Negro magazine in the country. Randolph also was anti-war. He opposed American involvement in World War I, and he definitely opposed African American involvement in World War I at a time when many African Americans, such as Du Bois, were advocating for African American involvement, thinking that this would be a great way for African Americans to prove themselves to white America. So in 1919, you have the DOJ, the Department of Justice officials, arresting Randolph for violating the Espionage Act, and they held him briefly. And at the time, they labeled Randolph to be the most dangerous Negro in America. And then in 1925, right, when Randolph is becoming a part of organizing for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, we see Randolph facing the task of recruiting support for the Brotherhood. He also had to win the recognition from the Pullman Company as like a legit union, right? And he also had to gain the union's acceptance by the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. And so there was a lot of opposition, and a lot of it came from the black community, right? So we see porters being too afraid to join the Brotherhood for fear of backlash or retaliation. We see black clergymen counseling against union activities. There's also black newspapers, including the Chicago Defender, opposing the BSCP. The Pullman executives largely ignored Randolph at this time, and they instead began to fire porters who joined the union, right? They were infiltrating union meetings with company agents. The company also organized the Employees Representation Plan, which was an alternative company union, which they claimed would actually represent black employees. However, especially at this time, a company union never works in the best interest of the workers, right? But often works in the interest of the company, which it did. And so, even though in the 1920s, the NAACP and Urban League supported the BSCP, progress was slow at the time. And so this brings us to the end of this segment. Stay tuned. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.